This is the third video in a series on the problems associated with biblical literalism. My first two videos concentrated on how a literal interpretation ran counter to certain arguments used by conservative apologists. This video, however, will concentrate on the logical and moral shortcomings of a literal reading of Genesis chapters 2 and 3. When reading the stories in Genesis, one may approach them in two general ways. The first is to treat them as literal historical events, and the second is to treat them as parables, which, while not literally true, do in fact reveal deeper truths. Let's examine the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and ask ourselves which approach fits best. A literal view of Genesis 2 to 3 presents the story this way. God placed the tree of knowledge in the centre of the Garden of Eden and told Adam and Eve not to eat from it or they would die. Later, a snake tells Eve that she can eat from it and she won't die. Eve then convinces Adam to eat the fruit. After they have done this, they understand good and evil and cover themselves up because they're naked. God then punishes Adam and Eve and the snake for their roles in the whole affair. Mortality enters the world and Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. Mankind has fallen because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve. The literal reading presents a number of problems, however, some trivial and some profound, which have been known about for many centuries. I'll set out the problems before dealing with one or two of the more common answers. Firstly, the narrative doesn't make a lot of sense. The fact that there is a talking snake is decidedly odd. Then a straight reading of the text depicts God as being absent rather than omnipresent. It even has God walking through the garden. And of course, why did God plant the tree in the first place? It would seem an important detail that's completely omitted, and the absence of an explanation leaves open a wide area for fruitless speculation, if you'll pardon the pun. Then there are the moral problems associated with the story. God doesn't need omniscience to know what's going to happen once he places the tree in the centre of the garden and tells Adam and Eve not to eat it. He just needs to know human nature. This story seems to portray the earth's first act of entrapment, and does not sit well with James 1:13, which says of God, "Neither tempteth he any man." The punishment also seems problematic. Most literal views of the fall portray all of mankind as having been punished for the sins of Adam and Eve. The idea of people having to pay for the sins of others is not only intuitively objectionable, it also seems to contradict Deuteronomy 24:16, which says, "The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin." Not that the word sin is always used for what Adam and Eve did. As they did not know right from wrong at the time, what they did is often called a transgression, but therein lies another problem. How then does the literalist deal with these problems? Let's look at them one by one. The problem of the talking snake has two possible answers. One is that animals in the Garden of Eden could talk, but not those elsewhere. Bizarrely, a more common explanation among literalists is that the snake was actually Satan. As far as I can tell, there is not much scriptural evidence to support this view, although I could be wrong. A bigger problem with this explanation is that if we accept that the snake was Satan, why were all snakes punished for the sin of the devil when he was disguised as a snake? How could God walk through the garden? Some apologists argue for an entirely metaphorical interpretation of Genesis 3:8, while a few argue that God here, and elsewhere in Genesis 3, only refers to the form God appeared in to interact with Adam and Eve, not God literally. So why did God plant the tree of knowledge in the first place? Most apologists say that God placed it there to test Adam and Eve. GotQuestions.org even goes so far as to say that God knew what was going to happen, but wished to force the choice. This, however, leads straight to the fourth problem. Did God set Adam and Eve up to fail? And if so, isn't that wrong? Here there is a plethora of different responses from apologists and theologians. Many answer I don't know, which is in fact a much better answer than it sounds. As an answer, I don't know admits curiosity and shuts out dogmatism. Another common answer is that God did set up mankind, but we can't judge God by our own standards. Both of these answers are better than any others I've heard, but even if we accept them, the question of entrapment is still a difficult one for the literalist to grapple with. Is it right to punish all of mankind for the transgression of Adam and Eve? This should be a troubling question for the literalist. The most common method used by apologists to explain this is to say that the descendants have now been born in sin. But this is little more than attempting to explain by avoiding the question. All of humanity is being punished, and it has been stated explicitly as a punishment for the transgression of the first man and woman. How could Adam and Eve have actually sinned if they did not know the difference between good and evil? Most answers to this tend to rely on speculating about exactly what knowledge the fruit actually imparted. As the exact properties of the trees are never spelled out, I suppose there is room for quibbling. So how do these problems appear if we take the story of the fall as an allegory? Most of the difficulties are suddenly reduced to the status of stupid questions, the equivalent of asking Brian what the birds' names are. The talking snake is not a problem, unless you've got a problem with Aesop's fables. It's just a story. Was God absent or moving through the garden? This is an allegory, so such details are unimportant. Why did God place the tree there in the first place? Dude, it's a plot device. It never really happened. Don't try and read stuff into it. Was it entrapment? Well, as it's just a story, we don't really need to make the assumptions that lead us to this conclusion. God is portrayed as less than perfect to move the story along, not to tell us something about his nature. Did Adam and Eve sin? Well, not really. They never actually existed. The most important of these questions, and one which gets to the heart of the story, is why are we being punished? The punishments meted out are, after all, real enough. Childbirth is painful and occasionally fatal. Eking out a living requires a lot of hard work. Why does this story say that we deserve this to be the case? One possible interpretation is that the story of the fall is an allegory, explaining a compromise in the human condition. We could live in a paradise where everything is easy and where there are no real decisions to make. Alternatively, we could take it upon ourselves to make our own way in the world. But in doing so, we are at the mercy of not only others with free will, but of a planet that does not always make life easy. It is not Adam and Eve who made this choice, as they never really existed, but it is in our own nature to make such a choice. This is the independence we would choose for ourselves, and as such, we are no longer in our Father's house and have to deal with the world as it presents itself, both in its beauty and in its cruelty. Admittedly, this interpretation is not without its problems. For a start, it is just one of a number of possible interpretations. Some will also argue that, as an explanation of the problem of the evil, it does not deal with gratuitous evil very well. Compared with the problems presented by a literal interpretation, however, these two problems seem utterly insignificant to me. The first problem is still present in the literal interpretation. There's a huge variation in the interpretations of the story's message amongst literalists. It could furthermore be argued that by depicting God walking through the garden and having a snake talking, the author, let's call him J, was doing everything possible to indicate that the story was not to be taken literally. Here, and elsewhere in the Old Testament, a literal interpretation defies not only common sense, but common decency, to say nothing of modern science. Were the story of the fall an aberration, the literal view could possibly still be defended, but many other stories, such as the Tower of Babel or of Job, present similar logical and moral difficulties. These stories are more coherent, logical, and morally sound when interpreted metaphorically rather than literally.